Hi, I hope you'll enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners who contribute either through Patreon or directly on our Buzzsprout website. I'd like to thank Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, Mikhail Legner, Abigail and Noah Broyles, and Rosa. Thank you. Hi, welcome to a special episode of the Lutheran History Podcast. Today's episode is special because it is once again based on one of my presentations I've prepared for another setting, but I wanted to share with you my broader audience. That being said, it is largely a visually enhanced presentation, so if you would like to watch the whole thing with the images, you can go to the Lutheran History channel on YouTube. Just be advised that you will see the same episode as a podcast as well as the visual presentation. So if you just watch the podcast episode, you won't really be looking at much, so make sure you find the right one. This presentation was something that I delivered in the end of April 2025 at the Society for German American Studies. Their theme for that symposium was German Americans in Print. And the Wisconsin Synod has a very long history of printing, a very long history of printing in German. And it being the 175th anniversary of the Synod, I thought, what a better opportunity to present at this nexus of all of these topics that we have in common interest. So I presented this, had some good conversations about it, but I want to share it with you. So today we're going to talk about Wisconsin Synod Lutherans print in German. Halte, hast. That phrase, Halte, hast, in German, is taken from the book of Revelation. It ends by saying, dass niemand deine Krone nehme. So hold on to what you have, that no one would take your crown of life. This phrase from Revelation sat on top of the front page of every single issue of the Wisconsin Synod's lay periodical paper, the Gemeindeblatt, for over 100 years, from 1865 until the very end of 1969. That phrase, hold on to what you have, at first may seem like an attempt to simply be conservative in every possible way. Hold on to what you have. Keep your German language, keep your German identity, but we'll see as we go through this presentation today that that's not exactly what that phrase meant, neither in the biblical sense or even in the way the Wisconsin Synod was using it. But for a while, we'll see that holding on to what you have was done in the German language. So we're going to take everyone back to 1850s Milwaukee. As we've often discussed on this podcast in the recent episodes, the Wisconsin Synod began in 1850 at the behest or at the instigation of Johannes Mühlhäuser, the first and founding pastor of Grace Lutheran Church, commonly called today Grace Downtown. We have a whole episode on Mühlhäuser. We've talked about him if you want to go and look at that for other information. But he and two other pastors were the ones who founded the erste deutsch evangelisch Synode von Wisconsin, so the first German Evangelical Lutheran Synod from Wisconsin. And we've talked before about how that name was perhaps a little misleading, not being the first German Lutheran Synod in Wisconsin. But it was German, it was Lutheran, and it was in Wisconsin. Officially organized in May 1850. And as the name would suggest, it was founded and led by Germans to serve Germans. So this was officially a German synod, not because it needed to be, but because it just happened to be that. Now, why would Germans print? Why would Lutherans print? Well, we had that episode on Brand Luther and the kind of secular historical question as well. Did the Reformation lead or contribute to the turning point in the printing revolution? Did the Reformation itself take printing from sort of an odd hobby by a few humanists and a few scholars who needed to print some Greek verses, or did the Reformation turn it into the popular printing medium that it still is today? Or was it the press that caused Luther's Reformation to succeed? Did the press, in a way, make Luther popular, keep him alive? Well, either way, it's clear that Lutherans have depended on the printed word from the very beginning of Lutheran history. And in a very practical way, of course, a Lutheran church, like pretty much any denomination in the United States at this time, would need things in print. Think about what you may still use in worship today. A hymnal. We often use service folders today, or PowerPoint projectors take away the need for print. But back then, you weren't printing off services every single week. You needed a hymnal. The pastor needed an order of service called an agenda. And then, of course, other needs like catechisms for students, Bibles, of course, and to support home devotional life, devotionals and other things like that. And you needed to communicate. Not everyone was going to be sitting in the telegraph office. Not everyone was going to follow Synod news by handwritten letter. No, you needed to have publications like the Gemeindeblatt that we mentioned. So early on, there was an instant need for something in print to conduct the business of the Synod at large, as well as weekly local worship. At first, the Synod didn't print much. When it did, it printed its Synod minutes from the conventions, the proceedings, I should say, of those Synod conventions. The first few years, they only kept it in handwriting in manuscript form because there were so few pastors, you didn't really need to spread copies, or it wasn't really economical. But when they started to print things by 1860, I have an example here on my screen. They met in Fond du Lac, and they took it to a local print shop in Watertown, and they just probably made a few dozen copies and then distributed them on a very small level. So you didn't really need a publishing house to print a few dozen copies. However, the thing that was used across the Synod on a regular weekly basis was the hymnal. And at first, they thought, well, we'll just survive with what people have brought with them. We'll get along with the immigrant hymnals. But as we talked about in a previous episode about changes in Wells worship, it was in the time of the judges. Everyone did as he saw fit, as Joel Otto has put it. So it was kind of worship chaos, worship anarchy. And if anyone wanted proper orderly worship, it would have been German Lutherans. The problem was the pastor would have to announce multiple hymn numbers if he wanted people to sing just one hymn. And then, well, maybe they didn't have the same number of verses. Maybe there was a textual variant where the words weren't all exactly the same. It was kind of worship chaos. So very early on, people saw the need. We need a single hymnal for the Synod. So it was proposed, well, why don't we just copy some other hymnal? Well, many of the hymnals in Europe were already unionist hymnals, so they already had blended Reformed and Lutheran theology in one hymnal, or some perhaps had overtly pietist ideas which weren't necessarily always theologically sound. What if we just copy another American Lutheran Synod's hymnal? That was proposed. They looked at the Ohio Synod hymnal, didn't quite meet the standards. Eventually, the Wisconsin Synod did decide, well, let's take Pennsylvania Synod hymnal, but edit it heavily. So the first Wisconsin Synod hymnal, which finally came out in 1870, was kind of a Pennsylvania Synod hymnal, but it was really its own thing. At first, official, regular Wisconsin Synod publication, though, was, as I mentioned earlier, the Gemeindeblatt, so the kind of a congregational paper is what it means, the Evangelical Lutheran congregation paper. And it was meant for both pastors and laity. It would share things like sermons, devotions, Synod news, church news in general, church history. It is in a way, the forerunner of today's Forward in Christ. However, Forward in Christ traces itself back to the Northwestern Lutheran, the English language, which for a long time appeared side by side with the Gemeindeblatt. So its family tree is not quite direct back to the Gemeindeblatt. Before they managed to produce the hymnal, they said, well, we've collected some songs for children, a Liederbuch for christliche Schulen for our school system. That came out in 1867. Then, 1870, they came up with the hymnal. Now, with a paper, with a school song book, and now a hymnal, there was a regular demand for several regular products. So rather than just hire out these on contracts to local places, they said, we want someone reliable. And did the Wisconsin Synod find a reliable person? They turned to the services of George Brumder in Milwaukee. Brumder today is still well known in at least German-American studies, as I found out at this symposium in Milwaukee. There was another presentation that talked all about Brumder, mentioned his Wisconsin Synod connections, but didn't talk about anything really I'm talking about today. Where we met in Milwaukee, we were with an eye shot of the Germania building, which Brumder built in 1896. The towers on it looked like German Pickelhaube helmets, kind of a famous local landmark. People still know of that Brumder connection with his large printing empire. He printed several German language papers. He was the largest German-American printer in the United States by the turn of the last century. He was recognized for his influence by presidents like Roosevelt and Taft. According to his grandson Herbert, George Brumder was even a guest in the White House because of this. But before he was printing national papers and before he was rubbing shoulders with the presidents of the United States, George Brumder was printing church papers. He was printing church hymnals, and he was intimately connected with Wisconsin Synod presidents. It turned out that 3 of Brumder's sisters married Wisconsin Synod pastors, both of whom became presidents. The first married Wilhelm Streisguth, came to America, but she passed away, unfortunately. So another sister came, and which isn't unusual at the time to take care of children. They also got married. So William Streisguth married 2 of Brumder sisters, and Gottlieb Reim married another sister, and both of these men were briefly Synod presidents in the 1860s. Wilhelm Streisguth did remain in the Milwaukee area for a while. In fact, he worked with Brumder to produce a small family paper in the late 1860s as well. Well, Brumder, as you might imagine, but perhaps not assume, was considered to be extremely religious in his Lutheran faith. And part of this had to do not only with his sisters and brother-in-laws, but the woman he married. He married Henrietta from Grace Lutheran Church, the very one and the same, pastored by Mühlhäuser. He married her in 1864 while Mühlhäuser was in his final years there, and he became a lifelong member there after that. And both Henrietta and George were leaders of the lay members of that congregation. Henrietta was known among her grandchildren for a famous line, "Du gehst zur Kirche." She would simply tell everyone in the family, "You're going to church." It wasn't open for discussion. And a good moral and religious example that she led for them. In 1869, Brumder signed a 30-year contract to print the Synod's hymnal. And Brumder himself worked very hard to promote this hymnal. He would offer to exchange a used or good condition Missouri Synod hymnal and give a Wisconsin Synod hymnal for free to people. Apparently, that hymnal was the one that was widely used in Wisconsin Synod congregations, but the Synod wanted to use its own, and he wanted that to be successful. So he even petitioned the Synod at convention to have the pastors do a better job at promoting this hymnal. 1873, just a few years later, he formed a local German Protestant Printers Association to publish what would become his most famous and popular paper, the Germania paper. It's interesting how this group of other German printers came up with some guidelines. Notice how they're Protestant printers. They weren't just Lutheran. They weren't Catholic, but they weren't Lutheran. So trying to find what is the baseline for content. What are we going to allow? Brumder was religious. He wasn't going to edit out all religious content. To him, that would be inconsistent with his faith. But he couldn't just have all religious content either. That would also be inconsistent with his faith. So they agreed on these guidelines. First, they quote, shall not contain anything that goes against the fundamental doctrines, and strictly avoid all confessional controversies. So they weren't trying to be controversial, but they were also trying to avoid going against certain doctrines. So the question is, well, what is a fundamental doctrine? That is the problem between Christians in general and especially Lutherans of this era. So Brumder, interestingly enough, took a position, a standpoint that his own synod had rejected just the year before as they joined together to form the Synodical Conference, where they agreed not just on some fundamental doctrine, but all the public doctrine they would agree on. And they, of course, had controversies as well that they got into. But nonetheless, this was Brumder's standard. He wanted to be a Christian person in public, and that was his guideline. It turned out that Brumder, as he gained in influence, was a powerful ally. In 1889, the infamous Bennett Law was passed in Wisconsin, which would have extremely restricted the ability of any school system that wasn't conducted in English to exist. It threatened to shut down the Wisconsin Synod and Missouri Synod and even Catholic and other religious groups, their parochial school system. So Brumder, along with the Gemeindeblatt, with its own editors, kind of waged a newspaper war against the Bennett Law and actually powerfully and openly attempted to influence the 1890 election, which arguably they did, and had the Bennett Law repealed, which, according to some, saved the Lutheran school system in Wisconsin. In 1896, though, Brumder got into trouble again with at least some Lutherans in the Milwaukee area. He started to advertise for the theater, which was controversial. C.F.W. Walther, among others, had been rather vocal against the influences of the theater, and they thought this was a bad thing. So they tried to get a petition for Lutherans to boycott the Brumder papers, everything that he printed. However, it failed miserably. So the question is, were these his own pastors trying to do this, just other ones in town? It's a little unclear, at least according to the sources I have. That would require some further research. But 1902, 6 years later, he ends the hymnal printing a few years after his contract. So the question was this Brumder cooperation for over 30 years, did it end on bad terms? Well, it doesn't seem that way. His grandson Herbert, in his biography, says that the Brumders were all intimate friends with all the pastors at Grace Lutheran, including some which were in synodical leadership or even synodical conference leadership, like Karl Gausewitz of the Catechism fame. So they got along well with their pastors. They were also generous patrons of other Wisconsin Synod programs. In the Diary Project, which I'll talk about some more later, Henry Koch notes in 1910 he went to a banquet for Northwestern College at Grace Lutheran Church in Milwaukee. Brumder was there, and he was rather generous with his donations to the college. And then Brumder happened to die just a few weeks later, and Koch again notes in his diary how widely respected Brumder was. So his reputation, at least to the average seminarian, was a rather positive one. Nonetheless, the Wisconsin Synod already had decided back in the 1890s to go their own way and say, we are going to have our own publishing house. No doubt they were inspired by examples like Concordia Publishing House, which had been around for a while in St. Louis. The Synod already had its own independent bookstore since 1876 in Milwaukee, and they established in 1891 Northwestern Publishing House. That was always its name. There wasn't a German version of that name, and it was always an English name, even though at first it was printing pretty much only in German. For a few years in the 1890s, they rented out various business spaces on the South 300 block on 3rd Street in Milwaukee. And then in 1913, they built their own place on 4th Street with rooms for bookstore, office, and print shop. And we have several pictures available showing first the rented spaces and things like the typesetting room, the mail room, the press room. They did 2 large presses. One was used for 47 years, and they complained by the end it was so loud you pretty much couldn't do anything else in the whole building while that press was running. Rather distracting. They had a bindery, a stock room, and the story was that the stock room in the basement was in the same space as the coal-fueled furnace without any kind of divider at all, and the employees lived in constant fear that some fire would get started between the coal furnace and the scraps and heaps of paper materials in the stock room, but thankfully that never happened. The high point of the Wisconsin Synod printing in German was sometime around the 1910s. You might say that 1911 was the high point because that's when the Gemeindeblatt reached 13,000 subscribers, but it really carried on through the rest of the decade. You can see ads in the back of the Gemeindeblatt for all the products available at Northwestern Publishing House. They were continuing to produce many different varieties of the hymnal, many confirmation versions with gilt covers, bound in leather, all this wonderful stuff. Interestingly enough, the one thing that Northwestern Publishing House never really did on its own was print a Bible. But of course, they were using a Luther Bible translation, and so many other publishers were printing exactly the same thing. Brumder was already printing a Luther Bible there in Milwaukee, and why compete with that? However, I do have an example shown here of Northwestern distributing a Luther Bible that was printed in Halle in Germany, so they would import it, but on the cover page it's distributed through Northwestern Publishing House. So they had their own supply of that as well. By 1917, we have a Wisconsin Synod produced catechism by Karl Gausewitz in German. Then we have other materials like the German Bible history book for Christian schools by August Ernst, which we mentioned in an episode about Adolf Heinecke, the president of Northwestern College for many decades. August Ernst. We have little things like a liturgical Christmas service for children by John W.O. Brenner from 1907, little things like that. Inside the Bible history, we have the Bible story with a picture. Sometimes Northwestern would republish old texts from Germany, like Stark's Handbook, a daily devotional. And if you're looking at the image, it looks like they're trying to copy something out of the 16 or 1700s. It's black and red font and print on the title page, very much like an older style of printing. So kind of a callback, a throwback to earlier things. And very often the covers were gilded or even embossed with different images. So high quality stuff, the highest quality you would find from pretty much anywhere else on both sides of the Atlantic. So quite a few examples of additional devotionals and home materials. By 1911, the Synod did produce finally its own agenda, its own order of service for pastors. So over 60 years of borrowing perhaps from the Ohio Synod or the Missouri Synod and finally just making their own in German. 1910s, you could say the Wisconsin Synod had arrived at being almost completely self-sufficient for all of its worship and catechetical needs for instruction. But the Synod was not insular. We see during this time that it had taken steps to share its theology, especially things like the Wauwatosa Theology. In 1904, we see the Theologische Quartalschrift, the academic journal for pastors and scholars, produced by and edited by the seminary faculty. We also see things like Adolf Heinecke's Evangelical Lutheran Dogmatics. So this is a systematic view of all theology in 5 volumes. This is one of the first complete Lutheran symbolical books, systematic theology books made original by the author, not just reprinted and edited from an old German Lutheran, but one written by a German American and produced in America, one of the earliest versions of that. And it was used by not just Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, but by other Lutherans across the country, especially these Northwestern Publishing House. These Wisconsin Synod materials were used by the Minnesota Synods and Michigan Synods, and this contributed to the merger with the Wisconsin Synod in 1917, along with the Nebraska Synod. So they contributed to Wisconsin Synod's larger imprint on the American Lutheran scene. However, almost at exactly the same time, we see the first signs of change, the linguistic transitions. By 1911, Northwestern Publishing House had produced 2 English hymnals. In 1914, the Synod approved the English periodical, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Northwestern Lutheran in English to supplement the German language Gemeindeblatt. On the first page of the Northwestern Lutheran, the author said, quote, "Even now our children are daily growing less familiar with the German language, and many of our young people use the English," kind of a Germanism there, "use the English almost exclusively, conversing and thinking in this only, so that if anyone wishes to make himself perfectly understood by them, he must convey his thoughts to them in English." It's around this time that we see that German Catechism by Karl Gausewitz, so there is an example of just a German version, but we also see examples of a bilingual edition, German on the left, English on the right. So what would often happen is the older generation pastor maybe only knows German, or at least comfortably. He only wants to preach and teach in German. The younger generation, they can maybe understand German, but some of those words, some of those theological, biblical words, and just German in general is difficult for them. So they may be relying on the English side. And of course, you would have some pastors comfortable speaking in English, then they would just use the English side as well, if all their students would. So by this, though, I want to point out that it's evident that there's already a linguistic tension. 1911, 1914, with that Northwestern Lutheran article and the bilingual catechism. By World War I. At least the narrative, or at least the story I told myself or was told, was that World War I changed everything. World War I caused the Wisconsin Synod to switch from German to English, but that switch in some ways was already happening. But there were definitely World War I pressures applied on top of everything. At first, the Wisconsin Synod was a bit defensive about the whole World War issue. They perceived that there were some threats to just being German American, and they didn't want to just sit there and take it, as they kind of had experience with the Bennett Law really just 2 decades earlier. They had fought off kind of anti-German bias in Wisconsin. They thought, well, maybe this is time to do it again in America, with influences like the Brumder Press, with national influence. They thought, well, maybe we could swing the tide in public opinion. So they would quote things from people who are anti-German, like this quote from an S.Y. Gillen from 1918, who wrote in Wisconsin in a paper, "By eliminating the German language, discouraging the marriage of Germans with Germans, and permitting the transmission of family names through non-German mothers, we may in one generation wipe out Germanism in America. Kultur will disappear and the Germans will be exterminated. By thoroughly humane methods, they will simply lose their identity." So they saw at least part of their identity under threat. And August Pieper, professor at the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Wauwatosa, one of the Wauwatosa theologians, brother of the more famous Franz Pieper, wrote a long series of articles called Unser Übergang ins Englische, our transition into the English, and he would talk about some of these things. First, he said, quote, "There certainly are exceptional adults who understand the sermon, prayer, hymns, and congregational gatherings better in English than in German. The overwhelming majority of our members, however, are German in their religion and want to live in German and die in German. As long as this group makes up the majority of our members, we dare not give up the German worship service." Went on to say, "While we would not want to try to prevent the transition into English, we must with all of our strength strive to retain the blessings that have come down to us in German. The sources of our spiritual life all lie in German, not one in English. The literature of Lutheranism is German, its catechism, its hymns, its Bible are German, and no one can make them English without damaging them." So it may seem as if he's bitterly opposed to giving up German. However, he wanted to see what's the main thing we're holding on to here. He was ultimately a realist focused on the purpose of the church. He said, quote, "As long as we preach only in German, these people, the non-German speakers, cannot hear the gospel because they cannot understand German." So we see that this decline of German, which was barely perceivable in the early 1910s, accelerates quickly after World War I. Until 1923, the synodical proceedings were entirely in German. Already in 1927, there was a motion at a Synod convention to make English the official language of the meetings. That was rejected. However, it was resolved to publish the proceedings in both English and German. So you would think, well, that would go on for a while, but by 1935, already there was only a summary offered in German. After World War II, Northwestern Publishing House moved from its old home. It was forced out by eminent domain from the city of Milwaukee. They got a nice new building in 1947. While it may show a lot of optimism, they were happy to have all this space, and that scary coal-fired furnace next to the stockroom was gone. A lot of good new things. We see one thing doesn't come over to Northwestern Publishing House. There's a large ad in the end of 1946, a closing out sale of German Wisconsin Synod hymn books. We see about over a dozen examples of German hymnals, and it's a closing out sale while supplies last. So the writing's on the wall. We're not going to be printing all these fancy editions anymore. If you want one, we don't want to keep the stock. You should buy it now. Pieper, in that article I quoted from earlier, noted that there was a great weakness, though, in the Wisconsin Synod's ability to even be productive in German. He noted that while most students speak German, they would do it only in class, where that was the language of instruction. He said while their writing in English was good, Pieper said, quote, "They fight an ongoing battle with German grammar." So German grammar apparently was a weakness in the parochial school system. Losing that connection with Germany was also an issue. Ernst Wendland, who a German-American Wisconsin Synod guy, before he finished his studies at the seminary in Mequon, went over to Germany to our sister synod seminary in Zehlendorf, where my great-grandpa happened to be at the time in Berlin. Ernst Wendland said, quote, "My Luther Deutsch from America, the German of the Bible, had to become the German of the present-day communication in radio and newspaper." So he was kind of speaking an antiquated version of German. He noted how when he would try to speak with people on the bus or the train, they would always ask him what part of Germany he was from, as if he had a very specific dialect, just being a German-American with biblical German. As I mentioned, great-grandpa Henry Koch was over there in Germany. He was one of the rare Wisconsin Synod pastors to get a PhD from a German university at that time. And he noted to someone else in America in the late 1930s, early 1940s, he said, "I don't want to belittle anyone, but, quote, the German spoken here is rather weak, to put it mildly. This knowledge of the living German language is very rare in our midst." So he's noting that having lived in Germany, there's a huge contrast in the quality of simple German American passed on from grandparents or great-grandparents at this point. So, as I said, the writing was on the wall. The end of German printing came within a few years after World War II. The dominant paper in the Wisconsin Synod flipped rather quickly from the Gemeindeblatt to the Northwestern Lutheran in English between 1936 and 1939. 1947, the Theologische Quartalschrift, that academic journal, its name was changed to a compromise name, the Quartalschrift, Theological Quarterly. Its last German article was rather brief. It appeared in 1952. By 1961, the Gemeindeblatt was still holding on with just over 1,000 subscribers, but the Northwestern Lutheran had almost 20,000, so quite heavily outnumbered. However, we see that Northwestern Publishing House still managed to print Gesangbuch, the German hymnal, in 1960, so it's a 90-year run for that hymnal. Inside the copy I have, I found pasted an order of service in German, but it's in the modern font, not the Fraktur font, with the lines that are sometimes hard for people to read if they're not used to it. But it doesn't have German type for this modern font. Things where you'd require an umlaut, those two dots over words, they're missing. They're putting an extra E at the end to kind of make the sounds work, but not in the standard way to print them. So they weren't updating the font. For the rest of the Gemeindeblatt or the hymnals being printed in the 60s, it's still in that old Fraktur font, which was used more or less up to World War II. But in Germany by this time, they had switched over to a Latin text like Antiqua, and if you were printing in Fraktur in the 60s, it gave a very evidently dated look, to be sure. So by the end of 1969, with the retirement of Henry Koch as one of the editors of the Gemeindeblatt ceased printing, and it was all over. So what does it mean to hold on to what you have? Halte, hast. Well, while nearly everything in German was coming to an end by the 1960s, it was all a personal preference. It wasn't as if there were still German-only speakers in 1950s and 1960s, but no, it was a matter of the heart. This is what people preferred, as people had alluded to. This is the language of their mothers. This was the language of that they had prayed to God. The elderly still wanted to die in German because it is remarkable that an institution so thoroughly identified with German, being the very first version of the Wisconsin Synod's name, has not only survived but grown since it has retired its mother language. Wisconsin Synod, WELS, and NPH still produce the same materials in English today as it did at its high water mark of German printing over a century ago. Giving up its mother language, the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans preserve their truer, deeper identity as Christians, as Lutherans, in a much deeper sense, perhaps teaching us a truth that faith itself, Christianity itself, God's Word itself transcends one single language, even though language may deeply shape an individual's personal faith. I hope you enjoyed this